Welcome back to Villain Week, which has barely even been a week of consistent uploads because we've had, YouTube glitching out and freezing my videos. We've had my Wi-Fi cutting out when I want to upload videos, which is why yesterday's video was a day late, by the way, guys. Even in comparison to what I said at the beginning of said video. But enough of my poor excuses. It's for Wi-Fi's fault. It's YouTube's fault. Today's Villain Week, as part of this little miniature listed series, is that of an exciting one because it's one I'm very passionate about, one that I've been looking forward to ever since I came up with the concept of Villains Week, and of course admiring for many villains found within our media, more specifically our film and our gaming media. And so for greatest honours and the greatest respects to pay villains of the villains from Skylanders, more specifically Skylanders Trap Team, because that entire game was made in service to villains. You, in that game, had to track down the villains that were broken out of Cloudcracker Prison, and that Cloudcracker Prison had shattered, creating crystals that were sent to Earth, so you could use those crystals to capture a villain, rehabilitate them, and turn them good in a way, bringing life to that lifeless crystal as the villain can interact with you through the portal. And of course, with that rehabilitated villain being a good guy now, you get to play as them with a tag team system between the captured villain and your Skylander. So naturally, Trap Team is a perfect thing to celebrate during a Villain Week because all of its villains are so damn great. And I have a lot of passion for them, which is why this is definitely going to be a long one, guys. So strap in and prepare for one heck of a great time as I analyse these villains and talk about what makes them so great, from their gameplay, from their boss fights, from their personalities, of course, their music that can sometimes build atmosphere, and, why it sometimes does and does not work and all that. So overall, everything that goes into making all of these villains of really high quality, their design as well, is also a contribution towards this list. Is basically what's going to be pushing certain villains higher up the list and certain weaker villains lower down the list. So without further ado, we're going to roll the intro and get into the Skylanders Trap Team villain rankings, every single one of them, mind you. Do you mind, laptop? Do you mind? Anyway, coming in at the very bottom of the list, none other than spot number 46 is going to be dedicated to Rage Mage himself. Now, this is a little bit of a rhyme right here, since the final three letters are the exact same in both of the two words within his name, but that's about where the awesomeness of this character begins and ends. His design is kind of lame, he's just effectively an orange mini type dude with spikes and feathers, which reminds me far too much of Double Trouble. So the unoriginality in design doesn't help the memorability of this character, not to mention he has no personality. And there's the fact that you never really find yourself using the primary attack because it deals such little damage and, does very little for you in terms of the offensive side, so you're much more better off with your Skarner, you could say. And speaking of your Skarner, Rage Mage can increase their power and speed, but just barely, and you often forget that that ability even exists. So naturally that makes Rage Mage one of the more worthless support-based characters, because his support abilities just aren't as useful compared to other support characters, which are far more memorable, or support villains I should say, to be more correct. That's a phrase, more correct. But as I digress, everyone's favourite phrase, really, Rage Mage is just a frustrating character, which is quite ironic considering his name is Rage Mage. He has a lame design, he has no personality to call his own, and he has a support option which barely even supports you, putting Rage Mage at number 46. But speaking of support characters, at number 45 we have Mastermind. Now Mastermind's primary attack is slightly better than that of Rage Mage, and I like the fact that he levitates too. Well, then again, so does Rage Mage, but Mastermind's looks more natural and creates for a nice looking animation, you could say. And I also prefer the colour palette here. The purples and the blacks just create a sharper contrast, make the character even more well designed, at least on a visual level. But unfortunately, once again, the support type attack, turning an enemy into an ally by brainwashing them. It's quite boring, really, especially when the enemy doesn't deal nearly enough damage as it should, and it doesn't wind up being defeated come the end of it, so once it snaps out of its phase, you still need to defeat the enemy regularly anyway, so for the lack of killing power that Mastermind has, makes him a villain you don't really want to play as all that often, and that's what puts him at 45 on the list. Now, number 44 is going to be Slobber Tooth. Slobber Trap. His name is so forgettable because it's so similar to that of Skylanders, and so is his design too. There's very little to differentiate him, making him a lazily designed, poorly thought out character that you forget almost instantly. So the lack of memorability with this character is ultimately what makes him such a weak villain. You don't even remember the moment you're introduced to him because he just makes the generic dog joke about, teaching a dog some new tricks, which we've heard 1,000 times before in any sort of dog related medium. So once again, the genericness makes this villain very, very forgettable and very, very weak because of it. In fact, his attacks in and of themselves are also weak, with one being completely worthless. Like, seriously, his slobbering is such a waste of an attack, and making you not really want to play with this guy because you don't have fun with him in gameplay and you don't remember him from a personality and lore design standpoint. Moving on to number 43, we have Chomp Chest. Now, I like the fact that it takes a traditional Skylanders item in the form of a treasure chest and turns the theming upside down with a treasure chest that can actually murder you. So the fact that it antagonizes common objects is really quite cool. But apart from that, Chomp Chest design is generic for that reason, that it's a object that we have seen several times before, and all they do is add teeth and eyes to it. And his gameplay is quite boring. He has a dash attack that's great for speeding him up, but it's not great for offensive capabilities whatsoever. Once again, you're better off leaving that to the Skylander. And he also has a search and find, which can allow him to dig up gold, but unless you know the spots, it's really tedious to have to look all over the place in order to, of course, pick them up on your sensors. So without a guide, this character is more frustrating than anything, and so I could definitely see the design with this character and the ideas behind it, but unfortunately the execution kind of sucks, making Chomp Chest a waste of a villain because he has two completely worthless moves that you completely and instantly forget about, putting Chomp Chest at number 43 on the list. But as for number 42, we have the Chompy. Of all the enemies in Skylanders to make a villain, a Chompy makes sense, sure, because it's the most common enemy in the whole of Skylanders. But still, there are way better enemies to put into this role than the Chompy. All this guy does is chomp towards his opponent and summon his fellow Chompies. It's such a generic moveset which you could predict just by looking at the character, so the fact that there's nothing forgettable, or nothing memorable even or surprising about this character is what makes it ultimately so disappointing. And luckily it does fit in with the villains a lot more than would a Skylander, since of course the Chompy is small, just like several of the villains we've already talked about, like Chomp Chest and Mastermind and Rage Mage. So the fact that he blends in together is quite good, and that's really what makes the Chompy worthy of a number 42 slot. That, and also his attacks are more powerful than that of the other enemies, making him far less worthless in comparison to them, but still he doesn't stand well on his own, putting him even at number 42 on the list. But as for number 41, we have Bone Chompy. My same problems with a regular Chompy arise here. It's just such a boring design to go with. Of all of the enemies in Skylanders to choose to turn into a villain, this is one of the most boring. But at the very least, it's far more engaging and more sophisticated than regular Chompy, with it being consistent of bones. And the fact that he creates a trap adds some sort of strategy behind his character, making you more invested in his gameplay. But that's about the minimal, I could say. It's a slight improvement upon the Chompy, but not by much, putting it at number 41 on the list right here. Now at number 40, we have Trolling Thunder. Honestly, I forget that this villain even exists because it's so forgettable. It's a tank. Big deal. I mean, I do like the fact that it has kind of like a face to this tank, of course. You have the mouth, that's kind of like the grill at the front. The turret is kind of like a nose, and then you have, of course, the wind nose that the trolls would see through as the eyes. So that's some really intriguing design. Oh, and then you also have the ears on the side, of course. The fact that the tank is personified. But apart from that intriguing design, the character is slow. It's not very maneuverable due to the fact that it's on tread, so you can't really move it all that fluently, especially not when it comes to moving left and right. You can only really move forward and backwards. The villain has some very boring, stereotypical war-type music that we've heard a million times before, so it doesn't inspire or get you pumped to play the character at all. His evolved Colour palette is again really boring and doesn't add anything to the design, and the gameplay isn't anything special either. I just really like the personification of a tank itself, putting it at number 40, and that's about it really. But number 39 is Shredknot. Once again, this villain has some terrible movement, same as Troll and Thunder, due to the fact that it just doesn't maneuver all that well, and that makes it far less fluent in combat, and it makes the gameplay for it far less fun, you could say, and far less paced, or slowly paced, to be more specific on that, because it just trundles along at a real slow pace. So naturally, this villain slows down the pace of the entire game and makes it a villain that you don't really want to play as at all, despite the high power levels that this villain possesses, which is just about the only thing justifying the villain's existence. But coming in at number 38, we have Gulper, a Doom Raider that has an incredibly disappointing boss fight. Like, seriously, you don't even fight this character. You just push Sodavats into place. What a massive disappointment for a Doom Raider of all things. I mean, I know it's the first level, but come on, at least make us fight him somewhat after he's shrunken down. So the disappointment in his boss fight, his design just looking straight up ugly. He has barnacles all over him, which is quite disgusting and gross from a design standpoint, and his of course colour palette for the evolved scheme is even uglier, so naturally you don't want to play with this villain because he's very visually pleasing, you could say. And you also have that movement problem I was talking about before, with him being slow, him not really having a proper plane of movement. He can't really move left and right all that well, just forward and backwards, and when he does have to move left and right, the animations just look kind of janky, and it does really break your investment with this character from a gameplay standpoint. So ultimately, Gulper isn't fun. He has an ugly design and a very disappointing boss to cap it all off with. But coming in at number 37, we have Smokescreen. Now, what I love about this is that it's the perfect appetizer before chaos, because it's a challenging villain, or at least a challenging boss fight, but not too challenging. And of course, there's also strategy behind it, because you can choose to kill off the villain in his boss fight at the perfect time in order to create a shockwave that defeats all the enemies around you as well, or you can leave him to last so that then the other enemies aren't bothering you whilst you have to deal with him. So either way, that added strategy adds further investment to his boss fight. But once again, it's his movement I have a main problem with. Now, I do like his gameplay. His attacks chain together quite well to make his gameplay feel very fluent and quite well paced, except for the fact that his movement is so slow and rather quite janky. Once again, his left and right movements don't feel all that fluent and smooth, and that just really breaks a lot of the fun you have when playing as this character. So ultimately, it's that movement style of his that lets him down. But moving on, we have Fisticuffs at number 56. Once again, or 36 even, once again we have a really slow character, but I love the design here. The fact that he has a giant fist of all things, you know, perfect for baseball and all, is really clever and very well thought out design. But unfortunately, the character has no personality to boot even. And his gameplay is so slow. You have to launch up his arm, then you can aim it, and then it takes like 5 years for it to come back down again. And the power does not justify how slow this villain is. You are far better off playing as several other villains that deal damage far more quickly than this one. So the fact that you just aren't really bothered with this villain and toss him aside for much better ones is what makes him so forgettable and worthy of being put at number 36 right here. But coming in at number 35, we have Tussle Sprout. Now, at the very least, this guy is very maneuverable and very well paced, and better yet, he has strategy, same as the Bone Chompy, because he can leave behind pools of acid and can poison enemies so that then they maintain damage being given to them even when you swap out for your Skylander. So that's really cool about him. I enjoy the gameplay, but unfortunately, the design isn't all that great. He's literally just a Brussels sprout. It's not even a good pun on exactly what the design is right here. So the fact that the design is so on the nose, so weak as a villain, especially when we have other villains that have such great concepts and theming behind them, it just makes Tussle Sprout ultimately really disappointing. And his music is also really off-putting. It's not fun to listen to in the slightest, and so because of that, you don't really want to play as a villain, because you'd way rather listen to the much better music from the stage itself, mind you. But moving on to number 34, we have Goblin. This guy is incredibly forgettable. I always forget this character when I have to name all of the villains, mind you. In fact, I almost left him off this list entirely due to how forgettable he is. He's another troll character, so him being in a game with lots of other troll villains just makes him mesh with the rest of them and doesn't give him any sort of distinctive qualities. Now, the main thing about this character is that his gameplay is actually really fun, so you actually enjoy the character whilst you're playing as him, but that's ultimately the only upside he has in comparison to the other villains so far. His forgettability really drag him down and make him very unengaging from a personality standpoint, since he's just your generic dumb troll, you could say. But coming in at number 33, we have Ice Cream. A little more of a fast-paced character, since she can either conjure a giant eyeball or smaller eyeballs, and her walking speed is pretty decent. And her design is also very intriguing. The fact that she, has hair that covers up her eye, her massive eye, mind you, which is inside her mouth of all things. It's freaky, it's unique, and it's distinctive. So that's nice to see, although her music does kind of ruin it because it doesn't build up any sort of atmosphere. And it's really just frustrating and annoying. Once again, you want to swap back to your Skarner in order to hear the music from the actual stage itself, a much better music. And speaking of swapping back to your Skarner, once again your Skarner is going to have the better offensive capabilities than this villain at hand, because her attacks are pretty weak, unfortunately, as well as much slower in comparison to her movement. So overall, whilst it was a great design, there are other things dragging Ice Cream down and making her one of the more forgettable villains of the game, putting her at number 33. But coming in at number 32, we have Sheep Creep. Now, unfortunately, Sheep Creep is pretty weak of a villain, and that's mostly because he comes in the first level, so you don't really want an overpowered villain right out of the bat, do you? But the fact that he fires off his corkscrew cannons with such speed and accuracy is really, really fun, actually, and it's got a really satisfying sound effect to it. And then, not to mention, he's got a cotton ball explosion, which is so cute. If you want a cute villain, then Sheep Creep is just about your only option, which in and of itself makes him distinctive. And just like Chomp Chest, it takes a common animal from Skylanders and antagonizes it, makes you fear sheeps a whole lot more going forward, which is very appropriate considering Imaginators and for Sheep Rebellion within that game, mind you. So, Sheep Creep, literally my only problem with him is his power level in comparison to other villains. You don't want to play as him and toss him aside for much more powerful villains, which are going to be far more effective in combat. But apart from that, he's still got a fun design that takes full advantage of your knowledge of Skylands. But moving on to number 31, we have Cruz. Now, I know I was just belly aching about movement being terrible with other villains, and this villain's no different, but the difference with this villain is that you can still attack enemies from all directions with his secondary attack, so that makes his gameplay a lot more balanced and a lot more fluent too. He also has some really awesome sound effects. When you hear him stomping, you truly, hear him stomping all the same. And what's so interesting about this villain is that whilst this troll is controlling a giant mech, he's not being lazy about it. When he punches, his mech punches. So the fact that the troll is doing the actual punching himself, and the punching is so fast and fluent, it just gives you more respect for the villain as a whole, because he's going through physical exercise whilst beating up enemies, mind you. And not to mention the involved colours of this character are really contrasting and really expand upon this base design you see right here to make you want to play as this villain even further. So once again, it's just that terrible movement really that makes this character drag down for me, and the fact that his power level isn't nearly enough, despite the fact that this troll is physically doing these punches. So I believe the power of the unit overall deserves far more than what it's got. So there is a slight disappointment in that, which again is another downside to Bruce Cruiser. But moving on to number 30, we have Brawl and Chain. One word: slow. This character is so unbearably slow. He brings the pacing of the entire game to an absolute crawl, and it's not like it's justified with his attacks either. They don't do nearly enough damage, although I do like the fact that when you spin, you deal damage to all enemies around you. That 360 degree effectiveness is unique to this character and at least fun to explore. But his design is similar to that of other villains, which we'll talk about later, which just makes him mesh in with the rest of them and very forgettable because of it. So ultimately, the only reason why I like this villain to begin with is because of, well, first of all, his variant has some really cool colours behind it, and second of all, he has a really awesome personality. The fact that he's just looking for a hug is just a really unique characterization of a villain that makes him slightly distinctive. from a character standpoint, even if his design is really lackluster and his pacing is awful. But moving on to number 29, we have Grave Club, who has the same gameplay type problems as Brawl and Chain, since he's incredibly slow, but he has a lot more power behind him, which justifies the slowness behind him, although fortunately it doesn't make him a more fast-paced villain because his pacing is incredibly slow, and once again he brings the game to an absolute crawl despite his power level. Not to mention he summons bones due to how hard he pounds the ground, so why the heck is he an earth element in that case? So the terrible elementalization of this character, that's a word I made up, so I've got to at least pronounce it correctly, is very frustrating, very disappointing with this character. And for only real saving grace is, of course, that power level he has. The fact that he is terrifying as a villain, because when he's first introduced, he is claiming that he's going to bury you alive. So the fact that you're really intimidated by this villain really gives you that incentive even to want to play as him, because you're so terrified by him. You'd assume that the enemies would feel the same way, so you having that power at your disposal is quite satisfying. And on top of that, he's also got an awesome design. He's a mummy, so of course he has his bandages wrapped up, his fists made of stone, which I suppose justifies the earth element on a design standpoint. I just wish his gameplay was more earth-based, like he summoned rocks rather than bones when he pounded the ground. Just a simple change like that could have made Graveclubber even better, but as it stands, at 29 we have Graveclubber. Moving on to 28 we have Dreamcatcher. Now I love the personality of this character. She has so much charisma and energy, but unfortunately her gameplay and her boss fight suck. She's an absolute joke of a boss, being even easier than that of a Gulper, who you didn't even need to fight, which for a Doom Raider is pathetic, mostly because of the jankiness of Trap Team as a whole, and the whole glitchiness behind the game, and it being somewhat unfinished, and her boss fight is a huge emphasis on that. And she's also got a pretty boring design. She's literally just a floating head with a giant bow and hair. Really long hair, mind you, which I respect, being a figure of long hair myself. But outside of that, Dreamcatcher is just boring to play as. She has terrible music, and her personality can really get on your nerves after a while, especially the accent. So despite it having a lot of energy and life behind it, there's no denying even that it becomes really annoying and really drags after a while. And speaking of dragging, because she's just a head and she floats, her movement, once again, is terrible, just like characters like Bruiser, Cruiser, and Shredknot that we've talked about previously. So there's very little for me to like about this boss, except from the personality being so strong. Moving on to number 26, we have Blobs. Now I love the concept of this villain, the fact that it's an evil Marbu, so it makes sense behind the context of the level that you capture him in, even for Mirror of Mystery, as you know. Marbus are evil in that level, so they was able to perfectly incorporate this design into a level, and it actually elevated the level's quality due to the villain and its concept. And its design is so cool, because if you look at just the face, it looks so terrifying, with of course the blackened eyes and the contrasting oranges and blacks and the sharp teeth, and then you look at the rest of his body and how miniature it is, and then you realise that you were scared for nothing, because it's more of a laughable based design than anything. So that alone makes Blobs seriously interesting from a design standpoint. And again, I like the contrast in colours, and his evolved colour palette is even better, with even greater contrast in colours, brighter ones at that, to make you really want to play as this character because he's so visually pleasing. But unfortunately his gameplay is quite forgettable. In fact, I can't even remember what he does for his main attack, so that's the ultimate thing, dragging Blobs down a few pegs. But coming in at number 26, we have Grenade. Now, this character might be small, but don't let that fool you, because this villain is a force to be reckoned with. He blows himself up so quickly, and it deals so much damage, and it's just so satisfying to hear the bang and watch the destruction take place, and knowing that that destruction was caused by you is just really satisfying, and it makes you want to play as this villain more, because you're satisfied by the carnage he can create. And not to mention, he's also cute with his size and all, but I'm glad that he proves that size isn't everything in a fight, because you do not want to go up against a Grenade. It can kind of blow you up and all. And his miniature Grenade minions, whilst being generic, since they have been done before in Skylanders with characters like Countdown summoning similar looking minions, Stat genericness makes this character far more forgettable because of it. But apart from that, just for overall aesthetic and the cuteness behind his character, just make him more memorable and kind of like, you know, even out everything that makes him forgettable that I was previously alluding to. Putting Grenade at the perfect spot of 25 right here. But moving on to the real number 25, Grenade was actually 26, my bad. But case in point, we have another character who proves that even the little guys can pack the hardest of punches, because BuzzerBeak, first of all, I love his sound effects. The fact that he sounds like a bird adds further investment into his character, because that's exactly what he is, a bird. But on top of that, he can launch himself up and pound himself into the ground, which is very brave and courageous of Little Bird. So because you kind of like look up to this bravery and respect, it gives you more longing to play with this character. Not to mention it deals so much damage, so it's very satisfying to one-shot enemies with a bird of all things. In fact, saying that sentence out loud alone is awfully, awfully satisfying. But moving on to number 24, we have Shield Shredder. Now, what I love about Shield Shredder is, first of all, his design for armor combined with the woodwork is just a really nice blend of the two materials, although unfortunately he kind of blends in with all of the other villains, because there are a lot of evil-looking villains in this game which are all far too similar in of themselves. So Shield Shredder does become more forgettable amongst the ranks of them because of it. But I do love his gameplay. The fact that he drops gears behind him and that he can charge forward makes him really, really fast-paced. And not to mention he has some really great villain music. And is just a really fun character to interact with overall, because his personality is also... I was about to say great, but then I remembered, oh yeah, it's quite lacking, and that's one of the more forgettable factors of the villain. Again, knocking it down a few pegs to make 24 its worthy spot, because his gameplay is just so fast-paced, making up for any of the flaws I might have with him. But moving on to 23, we have Brouris, a very charismatic villain with so much energy, since he's constantly reminding you that he's a Brouris in the greatest voice possible to really match with a villain. So that alone makes him memorable, because it's kind of hard to forget a villain when he's constantly reminding you of what he is and what he does. You know, he shoots starfish, which is a very generic gameplay style, since of course we've had that from Bombshell before, so the genericness does take away a lot of the memorability of the character, but the personality more than makes up for that, and as does the evolved colour palette, because the evolved colour palette looks so cool with some really great contrast and colours that really expand upon this original base design, mind you. But moving on to number 22, we have Nightshade. I love the contrast and colours right here with the purples and the blacks, and the evolved colour palette does this even better with even sharper, more contrast and colours to make Nightshade a true thief of the night. That gives him some great personality. And it just makes you really want to play with this character, because he seems so skillful based on his personality and his gameplay alone. Though unfortunately his gameplay is quite boring. All he really does is snag coins and throw bombs. So the genericness behind that, and the fact that it doesn't have nearly enough power backing it up to justify playing this villain over other dark villains is what's disappointing for me, really. But the design more than makes up for it, as well as the personality and charisma of this character. Though I hate his boss fight so much, the camera angles are messed up so you can barely see what's going on, and his attacks make no sense. They are too hard to predict even, and that just makes it a poorly designed boss, and a cheap one at that. So the frustration that I have with this guy's boss fight just makes me want to play with him even less, because I don't want to have to deal with, you know, even more frustrating camera angles which I established with this character due to that terrible boss fight. But moving on to 21, we have Bad Juju, who's really cool from a name standpoint alone, because you have Bad and Juju in combination with one another. It creates great rhythm when you say the character's name out loud. Bad Juju. Just say it with me, would you, to emphasize my point. But regardless, Bad Juju has some amazing contrast and colours, and the evolved colour palette truly does her design justice, with even more contrast and colours that look phenomenal with one another and truly fit for design at hand, which is very Egyptian based, and I love the symbolic nature, especially on her chest of all things. And not to mention, she's got a lot of charisma and energy behind her too, with what she says, the tone she says it in. Unfortunately, her attacks aren't really all that powerful and are a little too slow to justify utilising them, so that makes her far more worthless in comparison to other villains, and that's a huge letdown for what is, in other words, a very memorable villain based on the colour palette, the music above all, and the theming of the villain. But moving on to our top 20, we have Chill Bill. Now, Chill Bill, what I love about him is that you can freeze an enemy and then, of course, swap back to your Skarner to finish them off. It creates some great tag teaming strategy that, takes full advantage of the mechanics of Skarner's trap team. Though, unfortunately, the attacks themselves are very weak and don't really justify you playing as Chill Bill for the most part. But what I love about this villain is his charisma. He has so much energy and life being poured into him. It's just so fun to play as a character who's got such charismatic interactions behind him. But his partner in crime when it comes to chemistry is Broccoli Guy, because man does this guy have a lot of character behind him. And I also love the fact that he's formed out of broccoli, a vegetable that is traditionally hated by kids, despite the fact that it is delicious and nutritious. So, taking that common hatred of kids and turning that into a villain of all things and making a name so terrible that it's actually good is what really invests you in this guy's character. His music is, I'm not gonna lie, it's terrible, but it fits with the theme of a character because the whole idea behind the character is that it's terrible, but it somehow works. It's such perfect execution of such a poor idea, showing you that any idea, even bad ones, can work when executed to perfection, like with the case of Broccoli Guy. My main problem is that his primary attack is practically worthless, but you don't play Broccoli Guy for primary attack. No, you utilize him for the support-based abilities, and they are so useful because you can heal up your Skarner an infinite amount of times. So you can go through an entire combat scenario, have your Skarner on 100 health, just swap out for Broccoli Guy, and heal them straight back up before the next combat scenario. It's so useful, and because of that, you utilize it very often, making you more acquainted with a villain and making you remember him all the more for it. So Broccoli Guy, terrible character, but with perfect execution, it more makes up for it, making Broccoli Guy a very worthy number 19 inclusion on the list. But coming in at number 18, we have Crow, who isn't a unique creature in Skylanders because, we've had crow-based Skylanders before. So the design is kind of generic, but everything else more than makes up for that. This character has a lot of personality to boot, a evolved color palette, which some sharp contrasting colours to take full advantage of the design of Crow, and some attacks that are really, really fun to utilize. The fact that Crow summons crows to defeat enemies is so ironic and so investing from a gameplay standpoint. And not to mention there's so much detail put into the design of this character. Just look at his beak and the cracks and the damages that it has. It's so well detailed and phenomenal to look at, mind you, so on a visual level, Crow is very satisfying and more memorable because of it. And not to mention the fact that his whole villain quest is based on a pun. It's also quite hilarious and adds more memorability to the character, you could say, because you go through that villain quest to earn the awesome evolved format of a character. But coming in at number 17, we have Bombshell, a character who's normally really, really slow. So whilst I would bellyache about it normally, what's great about Bombshell is that his gameplay makes up for that. His bombs are slow yet powerful, so they justify the speed. And he's not a slow-paced character in the slightest because he has a dash-based ability, which is really, really quick and really speeds him up, which is very ironic, since he's a turtle, he's supposed to go slow, and yet he has one of the fastest dash attacks in the entirety of the game. So the irony behind it is really fun. The name is kind of lame, he has a shell and he throws bombs. Big deal. But apart from that, just the concept behind the design and the moveset being combined together to create that irony and the awesome music on top of all of that just gives a Bombshell atmosphere and memorability to it to make him a great villain and worthy of being included as number 17 right here, even if without the secondary attack he's incredibly slow paced. So without that secondary attack and that dash attack to speed him up, you definitely would have seen him much lower on the list right here. But at number 16 we have I-5. Now my main problem with I-5 is that when you start a sequence of attacks, whilst they are fluid and most certainly fun to perform, especially with the constant sound effects in the background to add further investment upon playing as this character due to the realism behind it all, it's very hard to change direction, and that's the main problem I have with the movement of this character. It does really wreck the pacing of him. However, the satisfaction of just pounding the ground and destroying all of your enemies in wake, and the chaotic nature behind it combined with the sound effects is so much fun. I also really hate the evolved colour palette though. The stars really do not work for this design, and you know, makes the character really ugly, even though his design once again is very, very unique. The fact that he has his eyes on his fists of all things is just something that no other Skylanders or villains for that matter really possess. So the uniqueness makes him more memorable, and above all, I just love the satisfaction of pounding the ever-living crap out of my enemies, and it makes him one of the most fun characters to play as, giving him a worthy number 16 inclusion within the list right here. But moving on to number 15, we have Scrap Shooter, who is so memorable when it comes to his dialogue delivery, because he says "see" after every sentence "see." So me and my best friend Luke Smith, see, love quoting this character every single time we end off a sentence "see." So that adds a lot of memorability behind it, because of course it creates some very interesting investment with me and my friends. And Scrap Shooter, based on that alone, is worthy for the number 15 spot. And on top of that, what I hate about his gameplay is that you have to stand still in order to initiate his attacks, and that does create a really big drag on the pacing. But those attacks, once you start getting them rolling, are fast-paced, are fun to utilize, and because you can maintain your distance at the same time, makes them really effective. And so because of that, you want to play as this character, not only based on personality, but on the fact, based on the fact that you're going to easily defeat your enemies with such a power unit. But coming in at number 14, we have Frankenstein, easily the best of all of the Evilican-based designs, because, well, he has two unique arms. You know, he has a shield for an arm, and then he has a gust-type arm. So for uniqueness and for differentiation between the limbs makes the character very memorable from a design standpoint. And not to mention the shape of him, for personality, it's all in reference to Frankenstein, which is some really clever intertextuality made within the game. And above all, his gameplay is also really fun. The fact that you can gust up enemies, or, you know, blow them away whilst being similar to Jetpack, but being better than Jetpack at the same time due to it having some actual power behind it, is ultimately what makes this villain so much fun. He has some great music to boot, so naturally you want to play as this villain just to hear the music alone. And his evolved colour palette has such sharp contrasting colours that really work for the design at hand, making it worthwhile for you to go out of your way to complete his villain quest, making Frankenstein overall a very well balanced character, even if he is very slow paced in his movement. But coming in at number 13, we have yet another very slow character when it comes to his movement. That's going to be Cuckoo Clocker. But that's not going to stop me from loving this character, because first of all, he is big, he is a brute, and so this design combined with the gameplay makes sense, because in the gameplay you can charge up your attacks to deal damage within the 4-digit numbers. He is the villain that can create the largest amount of damage with a single attack. So if that in and of itself is a reason to pick up this character, due to that uniqueness and memorability behind it because of it. And best of all, you can charge up this character, trick enemies into coming towards you due to how long the charge takes, and then just finish off all of the enemies around you because of the rippling effect. And no matter how many times the enemies attack you, the animation is never ended, you know. You're never thrown out of the animation for being attacked, so that, whilst it does minimalise the risk and reward-esque element of the villain, makes it all more satisfying to pound the ever-loving crap out of these enemies. And it's something that couldn't really be done with a Skylander, because whilst a Skylander certainly could rest in place, waiting for a powerful attack, of course them getting hit and losing health isn't very effective. But because Cuckoo Clock is a villain, once again it's taking full advantage of the game's mechanics. So the fact that this character looks like a brute and he plays like a brute is just so much fun, and really makes you want to play as this character, even because you really want to deal damage in the 4 digits. Believe me, it's highly satisfying to land that really critical blow against your opponents. And it's also so hilarious to just charge up his power and then one-shot a lot of villains utilising it. So Cuckoo Clocker is satisfying for all those reasons and worthy of number 13 inclusion, even if he walks at a snail's pace and is incredibly slow-paced. But the bruteful nature of this character makes up for that pacing. Now at number 12 we have Luminous. I love the design of this character, being a being. That's quite a funny statement right there, but regardless, he's a being of pure light, and surrounding him is armor that gleams and contrasts, and it looks so damn cool from a design standpoint. So visually you want to play with this character because he's pleasing to the eyes, and above all, his personality is also really cool. He approaches his defeat and of course his portal before being captured with honor and dignity. So that makes him unique from a a personality standpoint, although his design is also unique. And because of that, you really want to play with this character because you really want that honor and dignity to be shared with your Skylander as part of their tag team, you could say. And the whole of a Sunscraper Spire, him taking over for Mind of Mags, just makes the whole level more investing because of it. And that makes him a really, really strong villain because the level he's from is elevated by his appearance within it. Though unfortunately his gameplay is very uninspired and generic because he just fires off lasers and crystals in the same vein to Prison Break, just far less powerful and far less satisfying because there's far less reflective based nature to it. So naturally it takes out the strategy and makes it far too easy to win, unlike Prison Break, so naturally that really ruins Luminous for me. So with better gameplay and less generic of a move style, Luminous could have easily been pumped up higher on this list. But speaking of heights, we have Threat Pack next, but I completely forgot to put his image into the video, so my apologies guys. Number 11 is actually Threat Pack, and what I love about Threat Pack is his design and his personality. You know, I love the fact that he's a troll with a jetpack. And the fact that he uses water to thrust himself upwards rather than air, it really establishes him as a water element, so that's great. Elementification, you could say. You know, justification of that element. But as I digress, everyone's favourite phrase, I love the fact that you can just charge for Y button and then unleash a plethora of missiles that lock onto enemies, dealing huge chunks of damage, making him really fun and really satisfying to play as because he's so effective in combat. And so, above all, the interactions you have with this character through his boss fight, and the arena in which he's, of course, in charge and in control of, are just so much fun. The voice actor brings a lot of charisma and energy to the character, making him overall very, very memorable. But now we move on to the true number spot 10, which has been alluded to this entire time, Hoodsicle. Now what's so great about Hoodsicle is that he has such a perfect blend of speed and power. You can dash, create ghosts, and then slowly launch your Scythe attack, which makes all of the ghosts around you explode, which is great for crowd control. And any enemies that are directly in front of you are dealt damage within the 600 ballpark. How slow the attack is does not justify how broken those numbers are. Hoodsicle can just dash into a villain and one-shot them. It is so satisfying. And not to mention his design is really, really intimidating. You are constantly threatened by this villain, especially in the boss fight when he's very difficult to defeat and requires patience and strategy. So all those things in combination with one another make you really want to play with this villain, and that makes him so satisfying on a gameplay standpoint and on a design standpoint, which is why he kicks off our top 10. But moving on to number 9, we have Pinata. His colours contrast each other very, very nicely and look really cool, and it's a shame that the evolved colours aren't as bright and as contrasting. It really takes away from the design, if anything, so that's my main problem with Pinata, the evolved format. But apart from that, both of his attacks chain together very well and are very fluent, since you can, of course, barf out his pinatas and then pound them with your lollipop to create a massive explosion. That's really clever and takes full advantage of the fact that villains only have 2 attacks, at least for non-Doom Raider ones do anyway. And Pinata's unique design and unique gameplay style because of it just make the character all the more memorable. It's an example of, for developers, just running with a pun and making it work. But moving on to number 8, we have Chef Pepperjack with some amazing personality that's brought about by the tone of his voice. It's not just what he says, it's how he says it that adds so much charisma to this character, making you want to play as him. And not to mention he's fast-paced, he has dash attacks, he has crowd control, which makes him very, very balanced and just a character you really want to play as. And his design is really clever, being a, of course, jalapeno pepper that has fiery based attacks due to the spices he can conjure up with his chef based skills. It's just really investing gameplay style that takes full advantage of his design, so the gameplay and design just feeling like they fit together so well is again very, very satisfying. His boss fight is for right amount of challenging, despite the fact that it creates a huge difficulty spike in the game, so That's very frustrating, mind you, but it doesn't make the boss any less satisfying to play through, and it creates for very exciting clutches and locks. But Chef Pepperjack still isn't the greatest of Doom Raiders. For example, Dr. Crankcase is much better, especially from a personality standpoint, because, man, it's so much fun to interact with this villain, because he kind of, like, has respect for you, but at the same time is totally willing to take you down. So that balance in his character makes him just very, very satisfying to interact with, and above all, his boss fight is kind of terrifying because you need to multitask, you need to deal with goop barrels, Frankenstein's monsters, blades, moving platforms, goop hits, all at once, so you maintain constant investment throughout this guy's boss fight. But what ultimately disappoints me with Dr. Crankcase is the fact that his evolved colours do not contrast each other and do not have as much detail to them as the original Crankcase, because of course the original Crankcase is a very orangey brown type tone of colour for his legs, which make them look all wooden and justify the sound effects when you're spinning with them and moving with them. But that adds a lot of terrible movement as well. His dash attack deals decent damage, but it slows him down and creates for awful pacing of a character, and for his other attacks, whilst having great range, don't have great power to them. So ultimately, there are more powerful villains out there that you prefer playing as, despite Crankcase's awesome music and awesome personality to boot. But his villain quest is really disappointing. It's literally just an interactive based activity. You don't go to a completely different level to complete tasks, mind you, so that's very anticlimactic for a Doom Raid of all things, especially one that had such a chaotic boss fight. So yes, there's definitely a great blend of really high highs and really low lows when it comes to Dr. Crankcase, meaning number 7 is the perfect spot for him. But coming in at number 6, we have Golden Queen. Now, what I love about Golden Queen is her evolved form, the irony behind it, the fact that you evolve from gold to silver in a way, and the silver has far more contrast and colours and just really expands upon Golden Queen's design and makes her feel more metallic. I also love the fact that you can, earn gold from a villain called Golden Queen. So it makes sense from a design standpoint, so that's a very satisfying payoff for the villain. And on top of that, her boss fight is constantly investing, because once again you're dealing with multiple things at once, keeping your concentration maintained throughout the entire boss fight, and the fact that she grows ginormous is so freaking terrifying. And she's effectively the main villain throughout the entirety of this game. A villain which, of course, bests chaos, can turn anyone to gold with ease, She's evil and merciless, doing that exact thing to Callie right now. So there's stakes behind this character, there's consequences, and that just makes her villain all the more investing for it. And I really enjoy watching her personality unfold before me, because it's just so in-depthful and so terrifying. But coming in at number 5 is Choppy Mage, yet another villain with an amazing personality. He's crazy, and that's very, very distinctive and very, very cool to see. His interactions with his Chompy puppet give him great chemistry with literally an inanimate object. How cool is that? But on top of that, Chompy Mage's gameplay incorporates what we've seen from him already in Giants, so fans of that game are going to feel some great nostalgia when playing as this character, because he can turn into a giant Chompy and create a shockwave around you, or you can choose to just summon Chompies and whack enemies with your staff. It's just such a goofy gameplay style that matches so well with the cartoony design of a character. It just makes the character feel very fleshed out, and one that you really want to play as based on personality and the moveset itself, because who doesn't want to play as a giant rampaging Chompy? Although unfortunately the movement with this is very slow paced and very clunky, so that does take away from a lot of the fun you have with the character, because you want him to go left, and yet for him to go left it just looks terrible and performs terribly as well. So that is the one and only disappointing thing about Choppy Mage, really. That, and also his boss fight is really disappointing, especially in comparison to that in Giants, where Giants it was more oriented around dodging, but this time around it's more oriented around platforming, and it's nowhere near as challenging either. So all of those disappointments do drag the character down a bit, and it makes him not worthy of a number 4 spot, unlike Blastertron right here, whom a lot of people would call their favourite villain, and I couldn't blame you. The purples have really nice contrast with one another, and it's all an emphasis of this guy being a futuristic type robot, if I can even, use words, that is. But as I digress, I love this guy's gun. It's powerful. It creates a wide spread to justify utilizing this attack on multiple enemies at once. His voice and his personality are so robotic based, it reminds me of Soundwave, which I have no problem with whatsoever, and by Soundwave I mean the best Decepticon from the entirety of Transformers. Fight me. But moving on from, of course, the amazing gameplay, for really great contrast and colours to create that futuristic feeling, coupled out with the design, this character also has some great music and an amazing evolved format that just makes you want to play with this character more, because he's so creative on a visual standpoint and has that great personality to boot. But he's still not as great as Wolfgang, who has some amazing characters, since he's constantly challenging the other villains, and that's due to his brute strength and arrogance when it comes to his own power levels, mind you. So because of that, Wolfgang is really, really intimidating. And then when it comes to his boss fight, the fact that he brings up getting pizza in under 30 seconds brings a lot of life and energy to the character, and him being just so obsessed with music and his whole gameplay being based around that is really unique from a villain standpoint and not really something to be seen, and it's what gives him such amazing music as a villain, making him easily my favourite Doom Raider, because his boss fight is so creative. Once again, constantly investing, because it's very, very challenging, so you need to maintain your concentration in order to ensure that you don't lose 50 of your characters all at once. So he has a really great boss fight. I really like his evolved format, the fact that he becomes darker and even more wolf-like to increase the intimidation, and above all, his gameplay is really satisfying because he has a great mix of melee and ranged attacks, all of which are really powerful and very satisfying to utilize. So that makes Wolfgang worthy of our bronze medal on the list. But coming in at second place with a silver medal is Chaos. And what I love about Chaos here is that he's easily at the peak in this game, because you interact with him in the most in these games, really allowing his charisma and his personality to be driven home. This really humanizes Chaos and turns him into an actual character for once. So that makes Chaos a very investing villain from beginning to end, as, he creates twists and turns within the story that aren't surprising, mind you, but they still add a lot of forward-moving momentum and excitement to the plot. And his boss fight is so terrifying. The music is epic. The moves are hard to dodge and require constant concentration due to the difficulty right here. So the fact that Chaos isn't pulling any of his punches and creates a very memorable boss fight is amazing. But Chaos also has mastery of all 10 elements of Skylanders, so that's incorporated into his moveset. You also have, Chaos's floating hand and his Doom Sharks, which creates some great nostalgia for those of you who grew up with Skylanders from the get-go with Spyro's Adventure. So for the fact that his gameplay harkens back to his first appearances, his most memorable appearances at that, and for utilization of all 8 elements, making sense in all of the abilities that they do when you harness them, and just making you constantly strategize with Chaos as you need to time and think about what elements you want to utilize next. Just makes Chaos really fun on a gameplay standpoint, worthy of paying £6 for a trap for him and him alone. And not to mention, he's just so characterized and trap seems to make him a constant threat of force throughout the entirety of the game, because he's secretly up to something, but you don't know what, and that's what makes the twist and reveals all the more exciting. But my number 1 villain, without a shadow of a doubt, earning our gold medal, is going to be Taekwondo Crow. I love this guy. First of all, this boss fight is amazing because, once again, it requires patience, which is a great lesson to teach kids, because the more patient you are with this boss fight, the better chances you will have at surviving it. And on top of all of that, Taekwondo Crow has such great charisma. The voice actor brings such energy and life to this character. It truly characterizes this villain and makes him so memorable because of what he says and how he says it. You want to go to the Sky Highlands just so you can interact with this villain, have your have him spill his goofy little dialogue and just, you know, take what could have been a boring level, but Sky Highlands is pumped with charisma, atmosphere, and variety, thanks to the likes of Taekwon Crow, who elevates the overall quality of that level due to his charisma. And on top of that, you have a villain who is so much fun to play as, a colour palette which takes full advantage, at least in terms of his full format, of his element, because it's dark and it's brooding, which also matches the personality of a character as well. And then his sword strikes do over 300 damage apiece. That literally means that for spam of hitting a button 3 times, which takes you nanoseconds, you have dealt almost 1,000 damage. It is insane and so satisfying to reap such destruction with a katana of all things. If you guys can't accept that that's cool, then I have no idea what you guys think is cool, because Taekwon Crow is everything you look for in a villain. He's intimidating because he's fast, he's quirky, but he has charisma behind him. Some amazing interactions with the Skylanders. He elevates the entire quality of the level he's from, and because of all of these factors in combination with one another, the satisfaction you have when playing with this guy, because he has such a broken moveset, and some amazing music to top it all off, that's atmospheric. And you want to play with this character not only because he's broken with his gameplay, but because his music is so amazing to listen to. I cannot fault this character. He is a perfect villain and worthy of that gold medal, making him my favourite Skylanders Trap Team villain without a shadow of a doubt. Crypt Crusher, I know you agree, you better like this video. But now we're going to be bringing this video to an end. I want to thank you guys so much for checking it out, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. Until it memorizes, peace.